It begins with a single breath taken into a frozen night, like the intake before a plunge. Close your eyes and imagine metal so cold it sings under your fingertips, gauges lit like distant stars, and a wind that erases words. Somewhere beyond the rim of the airfield, the world ends and the mountains begin, a serrated, indifferent wall of rock and ice that has felled emperors, armies, and gods. Who, in their right mind, would point a laden transport into that dark? If you want to witness what courage looks like when measured against geography, and why a single aircraft changed the fate of a nation, subscribe and stay with us. Will one plane make a difference? Would 1,000? You will decide as the hour unfolds. Night on an Assam strip in 1943 smells of diesel and wet canvas. A Douglas C-47, its canvas patched, its skin full of service and soot, waits with its belly full of fuel drums, crates of ammunition, and the kind of quiet hope that has no name. The pilots are young, or they look young because the cold sharpens faces down to bone. They have maps that lie, radios that forget, and altimeters that must be read with suspicion. Outside, the monsoon drips into puddles that shine like black mirrors. Ahead, the Himalayas rise not as a horizon but as a verdict. The mission is simple in purpose and impossible in practice. Move life, fuel, bullets, spare parts, and medicine from India to China by air. The only road, the Lido Road, is months away from being more than a rumor. Sea routes are cut. The ground is hostile and occupied. Air is the only artery left. The route they fly will be called the Hump, a line of sky over the eastern Himalaya where altitudes climb and the weather becomes a predator. Without this lifeline, Chiang Kai-shek's forces would wither, the Chinese front, and with it a vast Allied strategy, would collapse. By the end of the war, the airlift would account for roughly 650,000 net tons transported across this mountain sea. Look at the C-47 on the ramp. Twin radial engines, long wings that will trade lift for load, a fuselage designed for paratroops and freight rather than comfort. It can carry roughly 6,000 pounds of cargo when pressed, sometimes more in improvisation. Drums lashed to pallets, crates lashed to the floor. Its service ceiling, on paper, reaches into the mid-20s of 1,000 feet. In practice, fully loaded with cargo and fuel, and with the oxygen canisters rationed, the effective ceiling is lower and the margin for error vanishes. The airplane is simple. The task is not. Navigation is a lesson in humility. There is no radar to paint a safe path. There are no reliable beacons once the aircraft leaves the Indian lowlands. Pilots fly by dead reckoning, by the angle of the sun when present, by contour and cloud, and by a faith earned in the hours and miles they have already survived. The weather will not be negotiated, it will be endured or betrayed. Winds can accelerate to gale force between ridgelines and then, in the space of minutes, drive a plane into a downdraft that the engines cannot overcome. Ice forms like judgment on propellers and wings. Engines that sound fit suddenly cough and fall back like wounded beasts. At what altitude do you press on and risk oxygen deprivation, and when do you turn back and condemn those crates on board to a different death? Those decisions are not theoretical, they are the currency of every sortie. Early on, the airlift was a patchwork of effort, improvisation, and courage. Chinese national aviation and transport companies, American transport squadrons, and a motley collection of civilian and military crews stitched together a route for one purpose: keep China, already strangled by invasion, in the fight. The first cargo flights were meager, a few hundred tons in the opening months, but each ton carried strategic consequence. Gasoline for fighters, radio parts that would restore command, medical supplies that would hold a division together. The pace would accelerate, sometimes in fits and starts, until the logistical machinery matured into the single largest sustained airlift the world had yet seen. By late 1943, the Air Transport Command took a greater role, and the operation scaled into a continuous chain of departures and arrivals measured in thousands of sorties. By its peak, monthly deliveries climbed to tens of thousands of tons, culminating in a single month that moved more than 70,000 tons. What does it take to move such mass over mountains that were not built for men? This was not merely a contest with nature. It was a contest with physics and material limits. A C-47's typical payload could be loaded as fuel bladders, because fuel was more valuable than crates, or as delicate radio transmitters that had to be secured against shock. Loading decisions were triage. Pilots and loadmasters learned to balance weight and center of gravity against survival. Too heavy and the climb out of the Indian valleys would sap the engines. too light and the strategic objective would fail. Flight planners calculated fuel burned on climb, fuel reserved for unplanned holds, and the extra fuel needed to feather the aircraft through unexpected weather diversions. They accounted, grimly, for the fact that many flights would be one-way in effect. An aircraft might reach China but be incapable of returning without refueling. Those constraints shaped every human choice and every machine adjustment. The men who flew these missions kept two books in their heads, one of maps and numbers, the other of stories. A mission brief could read like arithmetic, but once the engine started, arithmetic gave way to memory. Veterans spoke of a sky that had moods. They remembered sudden clearings where the stars seemed close enough to touch, and they remembered cloud banks that ate altimeters and turned compasses into perverse instruments. A pilot once described losing the horizon and feeling the aircraft rearrange itself under his hands, as if some giant had lifted the world and tilted it. What did they trust then? Instruments, yes, until those instruments failed. They trusted the feel of the controls, the only honest voice left when the lights blink and the radio becomes static. They trusted each other. Do we, watching from decades away, know what that trust costs? Would we have the steadiness to answer when a gauge whispers failure at 1 a.m., with oxygen thinning and a mountain peak waiting like a fist? The politics behind the airlift were as urgent as the physics. Chiang Kai-shek's forces depended on material to sustain resistance and to coordinate offensives with Allied planning. 4 Allied commanders, keeping China active, forced Japanese resources to be held in place, resources that might otherwise sweep into Southeast Asia or threaten supply lines elsewhere. In conferences and maps, diplomats and generals argued terms and tonnage targets. Promises were made, ambitious targets set by Washington and theater commanders, and those targets drove expansion of the air bridge. Logistics officers learned to translate political deadlines into runway schedules. The result was an escalation in sorties that strained both men and machines toward breaking. Could administrative will alone summon the weather to cooperate? History would test that assumption. Losses were part truth, part silence. There are evenings at forward mess halls where pilots would sit in a weary ring and count planes like men count friends. Gone here, lost there, sometimes simply missing without closure. Numbers can both reveal and obscure. Historians tally hundreds of aircraft and over 1,000 aircrew lost in the course of the airlift, figures drawn from patches of record and rumor. To the crewman who watched an engine die and a wingtip disappear into cloud, the statistics meant little compared to the immediate and absolute fact of survival. Still, the aggregate cannot be ignored. For every ton delivered, there was a price paid in metal and blood, and those prices fed calculations back home about risk, necessity, and the value of continuing. What is the ledger we use to weigh strategy against sacrifice? Night deepens. Engines cough. The C-47 rolls, its heavy wheels lift off the soggy clay of Assam, and the nose climbs toward an indifferent ceiling. Inside, the crew moves in practiced silence, hands on throttles, eyes on instruments that glow a steady, betraying green. A navigator cross-checks a heading against a patchwork of fixes gleaned from radio beacons and landmarks swallowed by clouds. A loadmaster keeps count of the barrels. Someone mutters about carburetor heat. Someone else watches a needle that must not fall. There is no soundtrack but the plane, and the plane sings the only song that matters: forward. Will the weather break in their favor, or will a cloud bank with a mind of its own turn flight into grave? Who decides, in that small cockpit, whether to press through or to turn back and try again tomorrow? The answer rests on 100 tiny verdicts made in the dark. Beyond the human drama, the technical ballet continues. Propellers bite air that grows thinner each 1,000 feet, and engines that deliver at low altitude begin to cough as compression and temperature shift. Pilots lean mixtures, adjust pitch, and coax climb rates out of machines that have seen better days. De-icing equipment is minimal. Sometimes the crew must rely on exhaust heat and luck to prevent wing glaze. Radios cut in and out. Magnetic compasses deviate under the influence of local anomalies. Every instrument is both ally and liar. The crew's task is to synthesize imperfect data into a single, survival-oriented decision. How do you navigate when your tools are compromised and the stakes are national? As the C-47 eats its way east, the first outlines of the mountains appear. Not peaks but ridgelines at first, then shoulders of black rock lit in passing by lightning, then in full daylight an architecture of stone older than any nation. Crews would later describe a sky that felt like a cathedral, vast, arched, keepers of a silence you could drown in. Over those ridges, pilots would fight winds that reversed without warning. They would watch altimeters wobble and feel the thinness of air press the human body toward sleep, toward a kind of chemical surrender if oxygen was not enough. They would learn to breathe slower, to ration courage, to make choices under a sky that resented calculations. This is not theater, it is physics, cold, indifferent, exacting. By the time the aircraft crosses into Chinese airspace, the crew knows that they have paid a toll simply to arrive. There will be another toll to land, often at small, hastily cleared strips that required as much skill to reach as any mountain pass. The unloading must be fast because fuel and time are counted in minutes, and because every minute on the ground is another minute in which the aircraft may be vulnerable to weather or to enemy action. The cargo that disembarks will go to the front lines, to repair shops, to medics. A single drum of fuel might mean the difference between a squadron that can fly tomorrow and a squadron that will sleep for lack of gasoline. Is the value of one drum quantifiable? To those who depend on it, unmistakably yes. That first night, the C-47 will touch down under a sky that feels both hostile and generous. Crews will exchange tired jokes. They will check the logbooks. They will count what came loose and what did not. Somewhere, a supply officer will scratch a number in a ledger, and that number will be transmitted and folded into the strategy table that plans for months ahead. The hump is both a corridor and a narrative. Each sortie writes a sentence in a story of persistence. What begins as the work of a few improvising crews becomes, over months and then years, a sustained operation that will alter the map of war. They do it for reasons that mix duty with stubbornness, professional pride with an almost private devotion to those parcels of metal and canvas that must not be lost. They do it because there is no other way. They do it because, when a nation leans on an air bridge, each flight becomes an argument, between despair and endurance, between geography and willpower. And so the plane taxis again, refueled, rechecked, and ready to climb back into the void. The sky waits, indifferent and immense. What will the next hours demand? What tragedies, what small triumphs? The answer will come with the next beat of those engines, with the next threaded needle of a valley, with the next decision in a cockpit that knows its place is not safe but necessary. They call it the roof of the world, but for the pilots who flew the hump, it was something closer to the edge of it. Beneath the pale blue thinness of air, engines struggled to breathe, just like the men inside them. You could taste metal in the back of your throat, a mix of oil vapor and oxygen starvation. And when the sun rose over the snowfields, its light was so bright it burned through the cockpit glass like truth itself. No one had flown these routes before the war. There were no manuals for wind shear that could lift a plane 1,000 feet in an instant, or drop it twice that in the next heartbeat. These mountains were not enemies that could be outmaneuvered. They were indifferent forces of nature that made no distinction between courage and recklessness. And yet, every morning more C-47s took off. What makes a man climb back into a machine that has already tried to kill him? Was it duty, habit, or something else? Something that kept him tethered to a sky that wanted him gone? Each flight log reads like an epitaph written before death. Takeoff time, cargo weight, destination, expected arrival. And then, sometimes, a line that ends abruptly, the ink fading out mid-sentence. By late 1943 the route was eating airplanes. Crews reported downdrafts so violent that altimeters spun like compass needles in a magnetic storm. Some pilots climbed higher to escape, only to find the air so thin that their engines gasped and quit. Others hugged the valleys, flying through gaps no wider than courage itself. If they were lucky, they found a current that carried them through. If not, the mountains swallowed them whole. It was around this time that engineers began modifying the C-47s. The Pratt & Whitney R1830 engines were tuned for better high-altitude performance. De-icing boots were fitted, though they failed as often as they worked. Oxygen systems were tested, repaired, rationed. The goal was not perfection, only survival. Every new part was a prayer made of metal. To understand what it meant to fly over the hump, you must imagine a sky with no mercy. Picture a pilot at 14,000 feet, frost creeping along the windshield, gauges trembling in protest. He can see nothing but the blinding white of cloud and snow. Somewhere below him are ridgelines higher than his flight ceiling. Somewhere ahead is China, invisible, improbable, necessary. At night they flew by dead reckoning and faith. The moon was both guide and illusion, its light flattening distance into mirage. Sometimes over the radio, a calm voice would break through static, reading coordinates like a prayer. Grid 7 echo, course correction to 90 degrees. Then silence. Many never answered back. But not all losses came from weather. Japanese interceptors occasionally patrolled the upper valleys. It was said that you could hear them before you saw them, the sharp growl of engines cutting through the wind, then the flash of tracers across the sky. The C-47 had no armor, no guns worth speaking of. Its defense was altitude and invisibility. When discovered, the only option was to dive into the mist and pray the mountains were lower than memory. As the months passed, experience turned fear into a strange kind of professionalism. Crews learned to read the skies like surgeons read pulses, through rhythm, pressure, and instinct. They called certain clouds by nicknames: the Widowmaker, the Boiling Wall, the Whisper. Each name carried a story. On the ground, the engineers of the Air Transport Command worked without pause. Engines were rebuilt from scavenged parts, propellers hammered back into shape, fuel lines patched with strips of tin. The mechanics slept in shifts under tarps, their hands black with oil and frostbite. They were the unseen half of the airlift, the ones who never left the ground yet carried the same weight of risk. And then, in the Chinese interior, another miracle unfolded. The supplies that did make it across transformed entire fronts. With each ton of aviation fuel delivered, a squadron of fighters could rise again. With each crate of ammunition, a division could hold a mountain pass for one more week. Strategy on maps became possible again, lines of defense stabilized. The airlift was not glamorous, it was logistical salvation. Still, every pilot knew the statistics. For every 100 sorties, at least one plane would vanish. No wreckage, no distress call, just gone. The mountain kept its secrets well. When the monsoon returned, even the wreckage that did appear would vanish beneath mud and snow within days. And yet, the flights continued. What? Because beyond the fear was something larger. The unspoken knowledge that every delivery, every successful crossing, was one more day borrowed from defeat. The American press rarely mentioned it. The Hump was a silent war, one fought not with artillery or assault but with airspeed, endurance, and faith in numbers. The men who flew it rarely spoke of heroism. They talked about weather fronts, oil pressure, and carburetor heat. But beneath that language of routine, there was a quiet defiance. Sometimes, between flights, they'd gather in the mess tent, steam rising from tin mugs. Someone would hum a tune from home. Someone else would read the latest casualty list in silence. And for a moment, the room would go still, a fragile truce between exhaustion and hope. Then, inevitably, someone would stand, stretch, and say the same line they all learned to believe: if we don't do it, no one will. There's a particular kind of courage that doesn't come with medals. It's the courage to keep doing the same dangerous thing, day after day, not because it feels noble, but because it has to be done. By early 1944, the airlift reached new scale. The Hump route became a conveyor of life, 24 hours a day. Convoys of aircraft stretched from India to Kunming, their flight paths overlapping like veins of light across the darkness. The number of operational planes increased, navigation improved slightly with radio fixes, and yet the losses continued. Even progress came with a cost. One pilot wrote in his diary, "The Hump doesn't forgive repetition. The moment you think you've learned it, it kills you." Perhaps that was the truth behind the whole operation. Not victory but endurance. Not triumph but persistence against the impossible. By the time dawn came to the next flight line, frost painted every wing like glass. The air smelled of fuel and morning fear. A young crew climbed aboard, their breath clouding the cabin. The engines turned, the ground shook, and for a moment all of them, the pilots, the loaders, the officers watching from the tower, held the same thought in silence. Will they make it back? No one ever said it aloud, but it hung there, between each takeoff and landing, as permanent as the mountains themselves. By the spring of 1944, the sky over the Himalayas had become an artery of war, pulsing, strained, alive. From dawn to dusk, from dusk into dawn again, aircraft traced invisible lines through the cold. Their routes, plotted on flimsy maps, crossed over some of the most hostile terrain on Earth. From India's jungle heat to China's high plateaus, the airlift had evolved from desperate improvisation into an industrial rhythm of courage. But the danger never eased. The higher the frequency of flights, the more the mountains claimed. Weather could shift in minutes, a warm updraft from Burma meeting the cold descent from Tibet. It created turbulence that could tear a fully loaded C-47 apart midair. Crews described air that seemed to twist itself, folding wings like paper, snapping fuselages in half. To fly, the hump, was to play a game with physics itself, and the odds were merciless. The U.S. Army Air Forces, seeing the mounting toll, began to introduce heavier transports. The Curtiss C-46 Commando and later, the converted bombers known as C-87 Liberators. They carried more fuel, more weight, and more risk. The C-46 could climb higher, up to 24,000 feet, just enough to skim above the worst of the storms. But at those altitudes, oxygen was as precious as the cargo they carried. Frostbite was common, fuel lines froze, and engines caught fire without warning. The crews joked bitterly, if the weather doesn't kill you, the airplane might. Still they flew. The statistics became surreal. By mid-1944, the Hump operation was moving more than 30,000 tons a month. Fuel for the Flying Tigers, spare engines for bombers, food, medicine, and hope. Every drum of gasoline delivered to China returned as fire from a fighter's wing. But each ton carried a human shadow. Dozens of airmen lost, aircraft missing, letters home unanswered. There were no cemeteries here, only coordinates where the wind never stopped blowing. One crew, led by Captain Robert Stone, left Assam on a clear afternoon. They were carrying drums of 100-octane fuel, bound for Kunming. Somewhere near Fort Hertz, their plane vanished. Weeks later, Tibetan herders found wreckage scattered across a glacier. A silver wing half buried in snow, the rest consumed by the mountain. The official report called it weather-related loss. But the men who flew after them knew better. The mountains were collecting their toll. What does courage look like when there's no one to applaud it? Maybe it looks like a pilot adjusting his oxygen mask with numb fingers, scanning dials that no longer respond. Maybe it sounds like a co-pilot whispering coordinates into a radio that has already gone silent. Or maybe it's quieter still, the decision to climb back into the cockpit the next morning, knowing exactly what the sky can do. Back at base, replacements kept coming, young men fresh from flight school still believing that training could prepare them for this. They learned quickly. The first time they crossed the ridge lines and saw the storm walls rising ahead, they understood what veterans meant by the white silence. It was a silence that pressed against the skin, the air itself stripped of sound, broken only by the low vibration of the engines, that fragile heartbeat against an indifferent void. Some wrote home describing beauty instead of terror. They told of mornings when the peaks glowed pink in the first light, when the clouds below looked like an ocean frozen mid-motion. It's like flying on the edge of heaven, one wrote, if heaven were cold and trying to kill you. Each route became legend. There was the low hump, hugging the valleys of northern Burma, treacherous with crosswinds and fog. There was the high hump, slicing across the roof of Tibet, safer from enemy fighters but lethal in its altitude. Pilots had favorites, superstitions, rituals. Some carried lucky coins, some refused to shave before a flight, others left a letter in their footlocker every morning just in case. The maintenance crews, those silent guardians of survival, learned to read damage like language. They could tell from the pattern of dents and oil leaks which cloud banks had frozen, which valleys had nearly killed a man. They patched aluminum skins with whatever they could find, tin, copper, even sections of other wrecks. In the airfields at Chabua, Dinjan, and Lido, the roar of engines never stopped. It was the sound of persistence made mechanical. But war, by its nature, demands more. By late 1944, the Allied command pressed for record tonnage. To meet it, pilots flew even in monsoon season, when the clouds thickened into living walls. Visibility dropped to near zero. Planes flew by instruments alone, and those instruments, often unreliable at high altitude, betrayed them. Entire flights disappeared into storm systems the size of small countries. No one knew exactly where they went down. The reports simply marked missing, presumed lost. And yet, the strategy worked. Supplies reached China in unprecedented quantities. American bombers now had enough fuel to strike deep into Japanese-held territories. Chinese divisions received food, ammunition, and radios. A front that had once been starved of everything but courage began to move again. The airlift didn't win the war, but without it, the war in Asia might have been lost before it ended. Even so, the psychological cost deepened. Crews grew quiet. Laughter became a rare currency, exchanged carefully over coffee before dawn. Letters from home arrived months late, often stained with the sweat of the journey. And always there was the weather, omnipresent, unpredictable, merciless. The historian who studies the Hump today might speak of tonnage and logistics. But the men who lived it spoke of something else, a kind of contract between themselves and the sky. They understood that each flight was a negotiation with chance, and that every landing was a temporary reprieve. In December 1944, a pilot named Lieutenant Andrews described his final crossing in a single line in his journal. "We flew into the storm. We came out the other side. I think it was beautiful." The operation reached its peak in 1945. Over 71,000 tons were delivered in a single month, a figure that would have seemed impossible only a year earlier. The airlift had become a machine of endurance, driven by human willpower and sheer necessity. But victory was not free. By the end, more than 1,000 aircraft had been lost. Over 1,500 airmen never returned. Their names were recorded, their remains rarely found. The mountains kept them, frozen in time, wings entombed in snow and ice. When the war ended, the Hump was quietly retired. The aircraft were flown home, or abandoned at remote fields that quickly faded back into jungle. The men went on with their lives, carrying with them the memory of skies that had nearly devoured them. And yet, even years later, some would wake in the night to the phantom sound of engines, to the smell of oil and frost, to a sky that still called from somewhere beyond memory. Have you ever wondered what drives a person to return to a place that almost killed them? Maybe it isn't bravery or duty. Maybe it's something deeper, the knowledge that in facing that kind of sky they saw themselves stripped of everything but will. They called it the Hump. History called it a supply route. But for the men who flew it, it was a mirror, and what they saw reflected in that frozen glass was humanity at its rawest edge. The end came quietly, not with a final flight or a sudden announcement, but with a gradual fading of necessity. By mid-1945, the Japanese front was collapsing. Supply lines once starved of fuel were now overflowing with it. Bases that had felt like the edge of the world began to look temporary again, plywood shacks peeling under the same sun that once froze their roofs with frost. But even as the war wound down, the airlift did not rest. Every day, the C-47s and C-40SXs still rose into the sky, still clawed their way over the same mountains. It wasn't habit. It was completion. The war had taken so much that finishing the job felt like reclaiming a fraction of control. Some crews were there from the beginning. Their logbooks told stories of exhaustion layered upon exhaustion, entries written in pencil because ink froze in the cold. Others were newcomers, drafted in for the final months, still unaware of how long the route had been swallowing men. Together they formed a living monument to persistence. One more flight, one more load, one more night above the clouds. By now they knew the mountains like old enemies. They could predict the moment a downdraft would hit by the way the altimeter trembled. They knew which valleys created whirlwinds, which rivers reflected enough light to steer by when the instruments failed. But knowledge was not protection. The Himalayas did not forgive familiarity. In June 1945, a formation of transports left Chabua in clear weather. Within minutes, a storm formed over the Patkai Range, a convulsion of heat and ice. 2 planes vanished. Another limped home with one engine dead and the wings iced solid. The rest landed in China hours late, their pilots shaking from cold and adrenaline. When asked later if they would fly again, every man said yes. Not out of courage but because that was the only answer there was. When victory was finally declared, there was no parade for the Hump pilots. They were too far away, too scattered, too quiet. Orders came to stand down. Some of the aircraft were reassigned, others scrapped where they stood. Crews packed their duffel bags, looked one last time at the mountains that had been both workplace and graveyard, and turned their backs on them. But leaving was not simple. For many, the Hump had become a kind of invisible country, a place carved into their nerves. In civilian life they carried it with them. The noise of an engine overhead, the sudden hiss of wind against a window, could pull them back to those high valleys where silence had a sound and fear had a temperature. A few returned years later. Climbers and explorers found wrecks scattered along ridges, their aluminum skin shining like mirrors under the thin sun. In some, the instruments were still frozen at the moment of impact, needles pointing forever toward nothing. They became relics, not of glory but of endurance. Decades passed, and the story of the Hump faded into the quiet corners of military archives. Historians would quote the numbers: more than 650,000 tons delivered, more than 1,500 men lost. They would describe it as the first great strategic airlift in history, a logistical triumph that kept China in the war. But statistics cannot explain what it felt like to breathe air so thin it burned, or to stare at a horizon that moved like smoke. What was it all for? The question lingered long after the last flight. Some said it was about keeping China alive, others said it was about proving that air power could conquer geography. Maybe it was both. Or maybe, beneath all strategy and command, it was about something simpler, the human refusal to accept limits. There is a moment that remains in the stories told by survivors. It's not about a crash or a victory. It's about dawn, the moment when a pilot breaks through the top of the clouds after a night of blind flying. Below him the storm still rages. Above, the sky is perfectly clear. The sun rises, staining the ice peaks gold. And for one instant all the noise, all the fear, all the loss falls away. He feels suspended between worlds, weightless, silent. Perhaps that is what the hump really was, not a corridor of suffering but a threshold. A place where men met the raw edge of nature and refused to turn back. Even now, pieces of those planes still rest high in the snow. Aluminum bones beneath glacial ice. Radios that will never send again. Somewhere out there, under layers of silence, lies a single C-47 frozen mid-descent, its wings still outstretched as if trying to rise again. Would you recognize its story if you stumbled upon it? Or would it look like just another ruin swallowed by time? History is full of battles and generals, dates and declarations. But sometimes, history hides in the quiet acts. The pilots who kept flying into storms they could not see, the mechanics who rebuilt machines that were never meant to last, the anonymous courage that made victory possible. Every empire has its monuments of stone. The Hump's monument is invisible, written in the air, in the routes once flown and the lives once carried across that impossible sky. And as years turned to decades and the mountains reclaimed their silence, the world below moved on. The Cold War began, new conflicts rose, and technology rendered the old airfields obsolete. But somewhere deep in the Himalayas, the wind still moves through narrow passes, carrying the faint echo of engines that no longer exist. If you listen closely, you might still hear them, a low hum fading into cloud, the memory of courage on repeat. And maybe that's what all history is in the end, echoes waiting to be heard again. It begins where it once began, on a runway carved from red clay, damp with rain, lined with ghosts. The war is over now. The hangars stand half empty, their doors hanging open to the wind. The jungle is starting to take it all back, vines creeping over fuel drums, moss swallowing the paint off old propellers. A single C-47 sits in the distance. Its fuselage bears the faded numbers of a squadron that no longer exists. The crew that once tended it has scattered, some home to farms, some to cities, some never found. But for a moment, let's imagine them here again just before dawn, standing in the mist that clings to the ground like memory. You can almost hear it, the slow churn of engines coming to life, the cough, the rise, the final steady rhythm. The same sound that once marked the difference between hope and oblivion. The same sound that tied continents together. History would later call it logistics, tonnage, efficiency. But to the men who lived it, it was something more primal, the sound of defiance made mechanical. Against gravity, against weather, against every reason to stop. The C-47 was never meant to be heroic. It was a transport, a workhorse, an unglamorous silhouette moving through impossible skies. Yet somehow, it became a symbol of endurance, not because it was perfect but because it wasn't. Its rivets leaked, its wings bent, its engines strained. And still it flew. Maybe that's what made it human. Years later, when the pilots spoke about the hump, their voices carried a strange reverence, not for victory but for survival. They would describe the way light hit the peaks at dawn, or how silence returned after a storm, or how the radio static sometimes sounded like breathing. They didn't talk about fear anymore. They talked about weather and fate and the fine line between the two. One of them, now an old man, was once asked if it was worth it, all the danger, all the loss, all the years stolen by a sky that gave nothing back. He paused for a long time before answering. It was never about worth, he said. It was about need. Somebody had to keep the line open. We just happened to be the ones flying through it. In that single sentence lies the quiet truth of the hump, that heroism often hides inside routine, and that history's greatest acts are rarely born from glory, but from obligation carried out again and again in the face of despair. If you stand today on those same runways in Assam or Yunnan, you will find nothing left but airfields reclaimed by Earth. But if you look closer, the soil is flecked with fragments of metal, rusted but unbroken. Each piece once belonged to a machine that tried, and sometimes failed, to bridge the unbridgeable. Perhaps that's all humanity ever does: build bridges across impossible distances, knowing they won't last forever but building them anyway. And if you look up, above the mist and the mountains, you might still see it, the faint shadow of a C-47 crossing the dawn, wings steady against the storm. For a moment you could almost believe it's still up there, carrying fuel, carrying hope, carrying the thin thread of connection between worlds that refuse to give up on each other. That's the legacy of the Hump. Not a place on a map, but a moment in human will. The reminder that survival is not the absence of fear, it's the decision to move through it. The mountains remain. The wind still howls. The sky is as cold and merciless as ever. But somewhere in the distance the echo of engines lingers, the sound of courage made real, fading into eternity. And as long as that sound is remembered, the Hump will never truly be silent. So if this story moved you, if you felt the chill of that high wind, if you saw what courage looked like at 20,000 feet, stay with us. Subscribe and step into the next forgotten chapter of history. Because the past is never as far away as we think.